Marcus stood in the boardroom, watching the executives shuffle their papers nervously. 6 months ago, he would have been among them, sweating through his shirt, desperate for approval, ready to apologize for ideas that weren't even wrong. Now he observed their discomfort with the detached interest of a scientist studying lab specimens. The transformation hadn't been pleasant, but it had been necessary. The journey began on a Tuesday morning when his supervisor, Janet, had publicly humiliated him during a presentation. She had torn apart his quarterly report with surgical precision, not because the data was incorrect, it wasn't, but because she could. Because he had given her permission through years of submission, of saying sorry when bumped into, of accepting blame that wasn't his, of asking permission when he should have been making statements. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The man looking back was a stranger he no longer recognized, or perhaps, for the first time, he was seeing himself clearly. Weak shoulders, apologetic posture, eyes that begged for approval. He had become everything he despised, and the realization cut through him like winter wind. The weak self must die before it destroys everything you could become. This truth arrived not as inspiration but as cold necessity. Marcus understood that every plea he had made, every time he had sought validation, every moment he had prioritized being liked over being respected, had built the prison he now inhabited. The bars were made of other people's opinions, and he had been his own jailer. The first step in cultivating cold-blooded authority is accepting an uncomfortable reality. Most people respond not to kindness but to power. They respect strength and despise weakness, regardless of their public proclamations about fairness and equality. This isn't cynicism, it's evolutionary programming embedded so deeply in human nature that even the most civilized individuals cannot escape it. Marcus began studying those around him with new eyes. The successful executives didn't ask permission, they informed. They didn't explain themselves unless strategically advantageous. They didn't seek approval, they commanded attention through sheer presence. Janet herself was a perfect example. Her power came not from superior intelligence or better ideas, but from her unwavering belief that her position entitled her to respect and obedience. The weak man pleads. He explains. He justifies. He seeks understanding and approval. The strong man states his position and moves forward, indifferent to whether others approve. This distinction separates those who lead from those who follow, those who command from those who serve, those who shape reality from those who merely react to it. Cold-blooded authority begins with the deliberate destruction of the needy self, the part of you that requires external validation to function. This destruction is not metaphorical but practical and systematic. It requires identifying every behavior, thought pattern, and emotional response that signals weakness to the world and methodically eliminating them. Marcus started with his language. He stopped saying sorry unless he had actually done something wrong. The first day was agony, every instinct screamed at him to apologize when someone bumped into him, when he had to interrupt, when he made a simple request. But he held his tongue and watched something remarkable happen. People began treating him differently almost immediately. Where once they had dismissed him, they now paid attention. Where once they had interrupted, they now listened. Next came his posture and presence. He studied how successful people occupied space, not aggressively, but with quiet confidence that said, "I belong here." He learned to speak more slowly, to pause before responding, to maintain eye contact until others looked away first. These weren't tricks or manipulation tactics, they were the external manifestations of internal authority. The psychological principles behind authority are brutally simple. Humans are pack animals who instinctively recognize and follow strength while avoiding those who signal weakness or vulnerability. This recognition happens below the level of conscious thought, through micro-expressions, voice tone, body language, and hundreds of subtle cues that communicate your position in the social hierarchy. When you plead, you signal that you are beneath the person you're pleading with. When you explain yourself unnecessarily, you indicate that your actions require justification from a superior authority. When you seek approval for decisions within your responsibility, you demonstrate that you don't believe in your own judgment. Every act of submission teaches others to treat you as subordinate. Marcus realized that his entire career had been built on a foundation of weakness disguised as humility. He had mistaken deference for respect, compliance for cooperation, and people-pleasing for relationship building. The result was a professional life where he was useful but never valued, included but never essential, consulted but never deciding. The weak self clings to the illusion that being nice will eventually be rewarded, that fairness exists, that good intentions matter more than results. These beliefs are comfortable lies that keep weak people trapped in cycles of disappointment and resentment. The world doesn't owe you anything for being nice. Your good intentions are invisible to everyone except you. Fairness is a concept invented by those with something to lose. Dark psychology reveals the uncomfortable truth about human nature. People are fundamentally selfish, driven by self-interest, and motivated by emotions rather than logic. They will use your kindness against you, interpret your flexibility as weakness, and mistake your consideration for subservience. Understanding this doesn't make you cynical, it makes you realistic. Marcus began testing these principles systematically. When a colleague tried to dump extra work on him using emotional manipulation, he simply said, "No, I won't be able to do that," without explanation or justification. The colleague was shocked but ultimately respected the boundary. When Janet tried to blame him for a project delay that wasn't his fault, he calmly presented the facts and refused to accept responsibility that wasn't his. She backed down. Each test confirmed what he was learning: people respect strength and prey on weakness. The same colleagues who had previously taken advantage of his helpful nature now treated him as an equal. The same superiors who had dismissed his ideas now listened carefully when he spoke. Nothing about his competence had changed, only his willingness to accept disrespect had disappeared. The cultivation of cold-blooded authority requires destroying three specific aspects of the weak self: the need for approval, the fear of conflict, and the desire to be liked by everyone. These psychological dependencies create vulnerability that others will exploit. They make you predictable, controllable, and ultimately dispensable. The need for approval transforms every interaction into an audition where you perform for others' validation. This puts them in the position of judge while relegating you to the role of supplicant. Authority flows from those who judge to those who seek judgment. When you need approval, you've already lost. The fear of conflict guarantees that you will be taken advantage of by those willing to be difficult. Conflict-averse people become the path of least resistance for others' problems and responsibilities. They say yes when they mean no, accept blame that isn't theirs, and allow their boundaries to be violated rather than create uncomfortable situations. The desire to be universally liked is perhaps the most destructive of all weak self characteristics. It makes you boring, predictable, and ultimately forgettable. People who try to please everyone please no one and inspire respect in none. Authority requires being willing to be disliked by some in service of being respected by all. Marcus spent weeks identifying and cataloging his approval-seeking behaviors. He noticed how he would modify his opinions based on his audience, how he would laugh at jokes he didn't find funny, how he would agree with positions he opposed. Each instance was a small betrayal of his authentic self in service of an approval that never came. The destruction process required replacing these weak behaviors with their authoritative counterparts. Instead of seeking approval, he began giving it sparingly and only when earned. Instead of avoiding conflict, he engaged it directly and professionally when his boundaries or interests were threatened. Instead of trying to be liked by everyone, he focused on being respected by those who mattered. This transformation didn't happen overnight. The weak self fights back with guilt, anxiety, and social conditioning that equates assertiveness with aggression, boundaries with selfishness, and confidence with arrogance. These internal voices must be recognized as the death throes of a self that has outlived its usefulness. Marcus faced resistance not just internally but from those around him who had benefited from his previous weakness. Some colleagues were resentful of his newfound backbone. Some friends felt uncomfortable with his refusal to be the agreeable people-pleaser they had known. Even family members questioned his new attitude. This resistance was proof that the transformation was working. The man who destroys his weak self becomes undestroyable by others because he no longer needs anything from them that they can withhold. He doesn't need their approval, so he can't be manipulated by its promise or threat. He doesn't fear their disapproval, so he can't be controlled by social pressure. He doesn't require their validation, so he can't be diminished by their criticism. Cold-blooded authority is not cruelty or aggression, it's the calm confidence of someone who knows his value and refuses to negotiate it downward. It's the quiet strength of someone who has destroyed the needy, desperate parts of himself and replaced them with self-contained competence. It's the unshakable presence of someone who has learned that respect is not given but taken. The psychological impact of this transformation extends far beyond professional advancement. When you stop pleading for what you want and start taking it, when you stop explaining yourself to people who don't matter, when you stop seeking permission from those who should be seeking yours, you begin to understand what true power feels like. It's not the power over others that's merely dominance. It's power over yourself, the ability to act according to your judgment regardless of external pressure. Marcus found that as his need for approval disappeared, his actual approval became more valuable. As his willingness to please everyone diminished, those who earned his favor treasured it more. As his desperation for acceptance evaporated, people began seeking his acceptance. This is the paradox of authority: the less you need it, the more others want to give it to you. The weak self dies hard because it has been rewarded intermittently throughout life. Sometimes being nice does get you what you want. Sometimes pleading works. Sometimes seeking approval leads to temporary acceptance. These intermittent reinforcements make the weak self addictive, like gambling, creating the illusion that if you just try harder, be nicer, or plead more convincingly, you'll finally get the respect you deserve. But respect cannot be earned through weakness. It can only be commanded through strength. And strength is not an external quality you project, it's an internal certainty you possess. It comes from knowing who you are, what you want, and what you're willing to do to get it, regardless of who approves or disapproves. The journey from weakness to authority is not about becoming someone else, it's about becoming who you actually are underneath the layers of conditioning, fear, and people-pleasing that have accumulated over years of trying to fit in, get along, and be liked. The authoritative self was always there, buried under the desperate need for external validation. Marcus realized that every time he had compromised his position to avoid conflict, every time he had apologized for things that weren't his fault, every time he had accepted less than he deserved to maintain false peace, he had been betraying his authentic self in favor of a weak persona that others could easily manipulate and dismiss. The destruction of the weak self accelerates when you understand that most people are not thinking about you at all. The approval you desperately seek from others exists largely in your imagination. They are focused on their own needs, problems, and insecurities. Your anxiety about their judgment is based on the false assumption that you occupy significant space in their mental landscape. This realization was liberating for Marcus. The colleagues whose opinions had once terrified him were revealed to be just as worried about their own image as he had been about his. The superiors he had sought to please were too busy managing their own careers to spare much thought for his feelings. The social dynamics he had navigated so carefully were largely one-sided performances where he was both actor and audience. Cold-blooded authority emerges when you stop performing for an audience that isn't paying attention and start acting according to your own script. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others' legitimate needs or concerns, it means distinguishing between what actually matters and what only seems to matter because of your psychological programming. The weak self is exhausting because it requires constant maintenance. You must continuously monitor others' reactions, adjust your behavior to please different audiences, and manage the anxiety of never being certain where you stand. The authoritative self, by contrast, is sustainable because it operates from internal rather than external reference points. Marcus began to experience what he came to think of as emotional efficiency. Where once he had wasted enormous mental energy worrying about how his words might be interpreted, whether his actions would be approved of, and how he could recover from perceived social mistakes, he now directed that energy toward productive goals. The bandwidth previously consumed by people-pleasing was redirected toward competence building. The development of cold-blooded authority follows predictable stages, each requiring the systematic dismantling of weakness patterns that have become habitual. The first stage is recognition, identifying the specific ways weakness manifests in your behavior. The second stage is replacement, substituting weak responses with authoritative ones. The third stage is integration, making authoritative behavior so natural that it requires no conscious effort. Recognition required Marcus to become his own anthropologist, studying his behavior patterns with detached curiosity. He noticed how his voice would rise at the end of statements, turning them into questions that sought validation. He observed how he would preface opinions with disclaimers like "I might be wrong, but," or "this is just my thought." These verbal tics were invisible telegraphs of insecurity that others read subconsciously. Body language proved equally revealing. He caught himself making himself smaller in meetings, hunching his shoulders, avoiding eye contact, and positioning himself at the edges of groups rather than in positions of visibility. These micro-behaviors communicated subservience so effectively that words became irrelevant. People responded to the message his body was sending, not the content of his ideas. The replacement stage demanded conscious intervention in automatic responses. When his instinct was to apologize, he paused and asked whether an apology was actually warranted. When his impulse was to explain or justify his decisions, he evaluated whether explanation served a strategic purpose or merely fed his need for approval. When he felt compelled to seek permission for actions within his authority, he forced himself to act first and inform others later. Each replacement felt unnatural at first, like speaking a foreign language. His conditioning screamed that he was being rude, aggressive, or selfish. Social anxiety spiked as his brain interpreted his new behaviors as dangerous violations of group norms. But observation revealed that others responded positively to his increased authority, even if his internal experience was uncomfortable. The integration stage occurred gradually as authoritative responses became habitual. Marcus stopped thinking about projecting confidence because confidence had become his natural state. He no longer had to consciously avoid weak language patterns because strong communication had replaced them. The exhausting performance of trying to be someone else was replaced by the effortless expression of who he actually was. Dark psychology illuminates why this transformation is so effective. Humans are wired to follow strength and avoid weakness because these patterns increased survival odds throughout evolutionary history. Strong leaders provided protection and resources. Weak individuals were liabilities who consumed resources without providing proportional value. These instincts persist in modern environments, influencing how people respond to authority signals. When you display weakness, you trigger others' avoidance instincts. They subconsciously categorize you as someone who will need more resources than you provide, who will create problems rather than solve them, who will require support rather than offer it. This categorization happens automatically and influences how they interact with you before conscious thought occurs. Authority signals trigger the opposite response. They suggest competence, reliability, and the ability to provide value and leadership. People are drawn to authority because it represents security and opportunity. They want to be associated with strong individuals because such associations elevate their own status and provide access to resources and protection. Marcus learned to recognize and leverage these psychological triggers without manipulation or deception. He simply stopped sending weakness signals and started projecting the competence he actually possessed but had been hiding under layers of artificial humility and people-pleasing behavior. The concept of emotional labor became crucial to his transformation. He realized he had been performing enormous amounts of emotional labor for others, managing their feelings, cushioning their egos, absorbing their stress, and taking responsibility for their emotional states. This labor was uncompensated and unappreciated, yet he had provided it automatically because his weak self believed it was necessary for acceptance. Cold-blooded authority involves redistributing emotional labor more equitably. Instead of managing others' emotions, you allow them to manage their own. Instead of cushioning their egos, you let them develop resilience. Instead of absorbing their stress, you maintain your own emotional boundaries. This isn't cruelty, it's respect for their capability and preservation of your own resources. The resistance Marcus faced during this transition revealed how much others had been benefiting from his weakness. Colleagues who had relied on him to handle their difficult conversations suddenly had to develop their own conflict resolution skills. Superiors who had used him as an emotional dumping ground were forced to find other outlets or develop better emotional regulation. Friends who had counted on his endless availability and support had to reciprocate or risk losing the relationship. This resistance often masqueraded as concern for his changing personality or criticism of his new attitude. In reality, it was frustration that he was no longer available for exploitation. The people who truly valued him as a person rather than as a source of convenience adapted to his new boundaries and, ultimately, respected him more for establishing them. The destruction of the weak self requires confronting comfortable illusions about human nature and social dynamics. The belief that people will naturally treat you well if you treat them well is naive and demonstrably false. The assumption that kindness and consideration will be reciprocated is based on projection rather than observation. The hope that fairness and justice will prevail without enforcement is wishful thinking that keeps weak people trapped in cycles of disappointment. Marcus had to accept that many people are opportunistic, taking advantage of weakness when it serves their interests and respecting strength when it protects them from consequences. This doesn't make them evil, it makes them human. Understanding this reality allows you to interact with people as they are rather than as you wish they were. The authoritative mindset operates from abundance rather than scarcity. The weak self believes that resources, respect, opportunities, approval are limited and must be competed for through pleasing behavior. The strong self understands that respect creates respect, that opportunities flow to those who demonstrate competence, and that approval from the right sources comes to those who don't need it. This shift from scarcity to abundance thinking eliminates the desperate energy that characterizes weak behavior. When you believe respect is scarce, you hoard it and beg for it. When you understand that respect is abundant for those who command it, you generate it through your presence and actions. Marcus discovered that authority is largely about energy management. Weak people dissipate energy through worry, explanation, justification, and people-pleasing. Strong people conserve energy by focusing on results, maintaining boundaries, and refusing to engage in energy-draining behaviors. This conservation creates a presence that others find compelling and trustworthy. The psychological principle of energy return on investment became central to his decision-making process. He evaluated relationships, commitments, and activities based on whether they provided positive energy returns. Interactions that drained his energy without providing proportional value were minimized or eliminated. Activities that energized him and advanced his goals received increased attention and resources. This ruthless prioritization might seem selfish to those accustomed to the weak self's endless giving, but it's actually more sustainable and, ultimately, more generous. When you maintain your own energy and boundaries, you can provide higher quality support to those who truly matter. When you stop giving indiscriminately, your giving becomes more valuable and appreciated. The weak self's greatest fear is being alone, rejected, or disliked. This fear drives most people-pleasing behavior and keeps individuals trapped in unsatisfying relationships and situations. The authoritative self recognizes that being alone is preferable to being surrounded by people who don't value you, that rejection from the wrong people is redirection toward the right ones, and that being disliked by some is the price of being respected by others. Marcus learned to embrace selective rejection as a filtering mechanism. When his new boundaries caused some people to distance themselves, he recognized this as a feature rather than a bug. Those who remained were more likely to value him as a person rather than as a convenience. The quality of his relationships improved dramatically even as the quantity decreased. The process of destroying the weak self is not about becoming cold or uncaring, it's about becoming selective with your warmth and care. Instead of being generically nice to everyone, you become genuinely kind to those who earn it. Instead of seeking universal approval, you focus on approval from those whose opinions actually matter. Instead of trying to be everything to everyone, you become invaluable to the right people. Cold-blooded authority allows for warmth and connection, but on your terms and according to your values. It prevents others from taking advantage of your good nature while preserving your ability to be generous when and how you choose. It protects your resources so you can invest them where they will have the greatest impact. The transformation from weakness to authority is ultimately about self-respect. The weak self lacks self-respect and, therefore, seeks respect from others to fill the void. The authoritative self possesses self-respect and, therefore, doesn't need external validation to feel worthy. This internal shift changes everything about how you interact with the world and how the world responds to you. Marcus realized that every act of self-betrayal he had committed in service of others' approval had been an act of self-disrespect. Every time he had said yes when he meant no, accepted blame that wasn't his, or allowed his boundaries to be violated, he had taught himself that his own needs and values didn't matter. The accumulated weight of these small betrayals had created the weak self that others found so easy to dismiss and exploit. The cultivation of cold-blooded authority reaches its maturation when external validation becomes irrelevant to your sense of self-worth. This is not indifference to others' opinions, it's the ability to evaluate their opinions objectively without emotional investment in their approval or disapproval. You become like a scientist studying data, interested in feedback that provides useful information, unaffected by criticism that serves no constructive purpose. Marcus discovered that this emotional independence created a paradoxical effect. As his need for approval diminished, others' desire to please him increased. Colleagues who had previously dismissed his ideas now sought his input. Superiors who had once talked over him now listened when he spoke. The same people who had been indifferent to his feelings when he desperately sought their approval now seemed concerned about earning his. This reversal revealed a fundamental truth about human psychology: we value what seems scarce and dismiss what appears abundant. When Marcus had been eager to please everyone, his approval was worthless because it was freely given. When he became selective with his approval, it gained value because it became difficult to obtain. People began working to earn what they had previously taken for granted. The final stage of destroying the weak self involves developing what can be called outcome independence, the ability to pursue goals and engage in activities without being emotionally attached to specific results. This doesn't mean not caring about success, it means not allowing fear of failure or disappointment to compromise your authentic expression or strategic thinking. Outcome independence eliminates the desperate energy that characterizes weak behavior. When you need a particular outcome, approval, promotion, acceptance, your behavior becomes constrained by that need. You avoid risks that might jeopardize the desired result. You modify your authentic expression to increase the likelihood of success. You become predictable and manipulable because others can control your behavior by threatening the outcome you desire. Marcus learned to pursue opportunities aggressively while remaining emotionally detached from specific results. He applied for promotions without needing them for validation. He expressed his opinions without requiring others to agree. He made proposals without being devastated if they were rejected. This independence allowed him to take bigger risks, make bolder moves, and present more authentic versions of himself. The weak self's greatest limitation is its inability to handle uncertainty. Uncertain situations trigger anxiety, which leads to approval-seeking behavior designed to reduce uncertainty through external reassurance. The authoritative self embraces uncertainty as the natural state of dynamic environments and makes decisions based on probability assessments rather than emotional comfort. This comfort with uncertainty became one of Marcus's greatest professional advantages. While others paralyzed themselves seeking guarantees and unanimous approval before acting, he made decisions based on available information and accepted responsibility for results. This willingness to act without perfect information or universal support marked him as leadership material in ways that competence alone never could. Dark psychology reveals that uncertainty creates opportunity for those willing to act while others hesitate. The people who rise to positions of authority are not necessarily the smartest or most talented, they're the ones who can function effectively despite uncertainty, ambiguity, and incomplete information. They can make decisions when others cannot, take responsibility when others deflect it, and move forward when others remain paralyzed. The destruction of the weak self accelerates when you realize that most of your fears are imaginary and most of your limitations are self-imposed. The consequences you've been avoiding are rarely as severe as your anxiety suggests. The approval you've been seeking is less valuable than you believed. The rejection you've been fearing often redirects you toward better opportunities. Marcus began conducting what he called fear audits, systematically examining his avoidance behaviors and testing whether his fears were based on reality or imagination. He discovered that most of his professional anxiety stemmed from catastrophic thinking about unlikely negative outcomes. When he actually challenged his fears through action, the results were far less dramatic than his anxiety had predicted. The weak self maintains power through emotional manipulation, making you feel guilty for asserting boundaries, anxious about potential rejection, and ashamed for having needs or wants that might inconvenience others. These emotions serve as internal enforcement mechanisms that keep you trapped in patterns of self-betrayal and external validation seeking. Cold-blooded authority requires developing emotional immunity to these manipulation tactics, whether they come from others or from your own conditioned responses. You learn to recognize guilt as often inappropriate, anxiety as frequently unfounded, and shame as typically unwarranted. This doesn't mean becoming emotionless, it means becoming emotionally intelligent enough to distinguish between useful emotional information and psychological manipulation. The authoritative mindset operates from the principle that your primary responsibility is to yourself, not to others' emotions or comfort. This seems selfish to those raised on people-pleasing principles, but it's actually more ethical and sustainable. When you take responsibility for your own well-being, you're not burdening others with that responsibility. When you meet your own needs, you're not expecting others to sacrifice their needs for yours. Marcus learned to apply what he called the airplane oxygen mask principle: you must secure your own mask before helping others. This meant establishing boundaries that protected his time, energy, and emotional resources so he could be genuinely helpful to others when appropriate. The difference was that his help became a choice rather than a compulsion, a gift rather than an obligation. The psychological shift from obligation to choice eliminates resentment and increases authenticity. When you help others because you choose to rather than because you feel you must, your assistance is more genuine and more appreciated. When you say no to requests that don't serve you, your eventual yes carries more weight and meaning. This selectivity extends to all relationships and commitments. The weak self accepts whatever is offered, grateful for any attention or opportunity. The authoritative self evaluates options based on alignment with goals and values, declining those that don't meet criteria regardless of how they're presented or who presents them. The ability to say no effectively is perhaps the most important skill in developing cold-blooded authority. Most people struggle with this because they've been conditioned to believe that saying no is selfish, that they must justify their refusal, or that they owe explanations to anyone who makes a request. These beliefs keep them trapped in cycles of overcommitment and underperformance. Marcus developed a simple framework for declining requests: acknowledge the request, state your position clearly, and offer an alternative if appropriate. No justification, no extensive explanation, no apology for having boundaries. This approach was initially uncomfortable but proved remarkably effective. People respected clear no's more than reluctant yes, and his eventual agreements carried more value because they knew he meant them. The weak self's need for approval makes it vulnerable to manipulation by those who understand these psychological weaknesses. Manipulative people instinctively recognize approval seekers and exploit their need for validation through conditional acceptance, artificial scarcity, and emotional blackmail. The authoritative self's independence from approval makes these manipulation tactics ineffective. Recognition of manipulation attempts becomes automatic when you no longer need what the manipulator is threatening to withhold. If they threaten disapproval, you're unaffected because you don't need their approval. If they promise acceptance, you're unimpressed because you don't require their acceptance. If they attempt emotional blackmail, you remain unmoved because their emotional state is not your responsibility. This immunity to manipulation extends to institutional and social pressures that rely on compliance through guilt, shame, or fear of social exclusion. The authoritative individual evaluates these pressures based on their merit and alignment with personal values rather than on the social consequences of resistance. Marcus found that his resistance to manipulation made him more valuable to legitimate authorities and organizations. Leaders want subordinates who think independently and can resist external pressures that might compromise their judgment or loyalty. His inability to be manipulated by competitors, critics, or opportunists made him a more reliable and trustworthy team member. The final test of cold-blooded authority is its sustainability under pressure. Weak people maintain their people-pleasing behavior only when it's easy or beneficial. When faced with real challenges, criticism, or adversity, they often revert to approval-seeking patterns because their authority was performance-based rather than character-based. True authority emerges from internal conviction rather than external validation. It remains stable when others disapprove, when circumstances become difficult, or when maintaining boundaries requires sacrifice. This stability comes from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and what you're willing to do to protect your values and goals. Marcus faced his ultimate test when a new executive arrived who tried to re-establish the old dynamic of domination and submission. She attempted to blame him for problems he hadn't created, demand explanations for decisions within his authority, and treat him as a subordinate rather than a peer. His response was calm, professional, and unwavering. He stated facts, maintained boundaries, and refused to accept inappropriate treatment. The confrontation was uncomfortable but brief. She quickly learned that he would not provide the emotional labor of managing her insecurities or accept responsibility for her failures. Other colleagues, observing his calm refusal to be bullied, began following his example. The toxic dynamic she had tried to establish never gained traction because it encountered immediate, professional resistance. The man who destroys his weak self becomes undestroyable by others because he has removed their primary weapons, his need for their approval, his fear of their disapproval, and his willingness to sacrifice his authentic self for temporary peace. Without these vulnerabilities to exploit, others must interact with him as an equal or risk losing access to his cooperation entirely. This transformation doesn't make you invulnerable to all harm. No one is immune to physical danger, economic hardship, or personal loss. But it does make you immune to the psychological and emotional manipulation that keeps most people trapped in unsatisfying situations. You become like a fortress with no gates, approachable to allies, impenetrable to enemies. The cultivation of cold-blooded authority is ultimately about becoming the person you were before society, family, and experiences taught you to doubt yourself, seek approval, and fear rejection. It's about recovering the natural confidence and self-determination that exist in every human being before they're conditioned out of us by well-meaning but misguided influences. Marcus realized that his weak self had been an artificial construct built from other people's expectations, social conditioning, and fear-based thinking. His authoritative self was simply his natural state, freed from the limitations and distortions that had accumulated over years of trying to be someone else. The transformation wasn't about becoming someone new, it was about becoming someone real. The journey from weakness to authority is not comfortable, but it is liberating. It requires facing difficult truths about human nature, challenging comfortable illusions about fairness and reciprocity, and accepting responsibility for your own well-being and success. The reward is a life lived on your own terms, relationships based on mutual respect rather than need, and achievements that reflect your actual capabilities rather than what others deemed appropriate for you. Cold-blooded authority is not the absence of warmth, it's the presence of strength. It allows for kindness without weakness, generosity without exploitation, and connection without dependence. It enables you to love others without losing yourself, to serve worthy causes without becoming a servant, and to contribute to society without sacrificing your own development. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because there is nothing left to destroy. The needy, desperate, approval-seeking self that others could manipulate and control no longer exists. What remains is competence, confidence, and clarity of purpose, qualities that inspire respect, create opportunities, and build the kind of life worth living. In the boardroom where this story began, Marcus now commands attention not through manipulation or aggression, but through the quiet confidence of someone who knows his value and refuses to negotiate it downward. He speaks when he has something worth saying, listens when others offer value, and remains unmoved by attempts to diminish his authority or exploit his good nature. The weak self that once sat in these meetings, desperate for approval and terrified of conflict, is gone. In its place stands a man who has learned the greatest lesson of all: the only opinion that truly matters is your own, and the only approval you really need is the kind that comes from living according to your values and pursuing your goals without compromise. This is the ultimate fruit of cold-blooded authority, not power over others, but power over yourself. Not the ability to control external circumstances, but the capacity to remain authentic regardless of external pressure. Not immunity from all hardship, but invulnerability to the psychological manipulation that keeps most people trapped in lives of quiet desperation. The transformation is complete not when others finally treat you with respect, but when their opinion of you becomes irrelevant to your sense of self-worth. The weak self dies not in a moment of dramatic revelation, but in the gradual recognition that you never needed its protection, approval-seeking, and self-betrayal in the first place. What emerges is not a new person, but the person you always were underneath the layers of fear and conditioning. No more pleas. No more explanations. No more apologies for taking up space in the world. The man who destroys his weak self stands in his own authority, speaks his own truth, and lives his own life, and, in doing so, becomes truly undestroyable.